Hi everyone. Good morning or good afternoon. Welcome to Synerzip's webinar. My name is Jill Hurston. I'm the Marketing Director with Synerzip. And I'd like to introduce Hemant Elhence and Vinayak Joglekar. They attended the Agile 2017 conference that was put on by Agile Alliance at the beginning of the month in Orlando. And they took many, many notes so that they could present to you their top 10 takeaways. So Hemant, go ahead.
Thanks, Jill. Good morning, good afternoon. Special tracks besides the regular tracks, which I'll cover in a minute. The stalwart track, which brings experts and often those who were signatories of Agile Manifesto in a fishbowl style format. I find that to be very helpful and very useful set of sessions, the ones that I'm able to attend. And then, of course, there are experience report sessions where presenters report back on certain topics. And then for last few years, we have had this lightning talk format also, which is very helpful, where a 3 to 7 minute quick talk presented by a variety of presenters in one session. So that session ends up having about 8 to 10 such lightning talks, which is also quite useful for very specific topics. And then there's a new format that has come up in the last couple of years called Audacious Salon, which is essentially questioning and having a very debate-oriented, again, all objective, fact, data-based and all data-driven and all that, but kind of questioning some of the topics related to Agile practices. So these were the special tracks. And then we had 3 keynotes, one on Monday morning with David Marquet. I'll cover that in a bit. And then one on Wednesday morning with Jay Zumble, and then on Friday morning with Denise Jacobs on creative topic. With that, let's go over to our top, which is actually 12 takeaways today, and some sound bites in addition to that. And I'll let Vinayak cover the first one, but before that, let me give you a glimpse of the tracks we had. These were the 18 or so tracks, plus OpenJam sessions. So the only new one worth pointing out this year, which wasn't in the previous years, was this track called Agile Companies, which covered topics of Agile, applying Agile principles and values to other departments in an enterprise beyond just software development. And you'll see some of that covered in our takeaways. With that, let me turn it over. We'll keep the pace up because there's a lot of content. It has usually taken us about 75 minutes or so to cover this. We're going to squeeze this all into 45 to 50 minutes, so we have some Q&A time also. So with that, over to you, Vinayak, for your first takeaway.
Yeah, thanks, Hemant. So those of you who were developing software in the 80s, like I used to do, we did everything by ourselves. So I used to sit on a computer and I would turn it over to my client, and client would take a look at it and say, yes, this looks good, or no, this doesn't, and then I would make some changes, hand it over to him, no QA, nothing. Come year 2000, we have QA as a part, and then it was normal to have teams with testers testing the software, and by 2010 we had DevOps, so operations became a part of Agile cross-functional teams, and we know the DevOps story as it unfolded. And today we also have the Lean UX folks join the team, and then we have a fully functional cross-functional team. So that's how it has been evolving. But in this conference, what we realized is that gradually the developer role is going to be taking up the roles in the development team entirely and gradually. So test engineering is the first thing that we will be covering, and see how developers are going to be a part of testing. And essentially what we are saying here is that testers are needed, testing skills are actually development skills. Similarly, we will be talking about NoOps, which basically means that operations would be essentially a part of the developer's portfolio, and going forward, developers would be handling operations, or operations people will have to have development skills. And finally, we will be talking about the new UX, where the entire team, including developers, participate in the user experience design. So essentially what we are saying here is we are going back full circle. We started with developers, and then we are ending with an all developer team. So that's what we are going to cover in the first 3 takeaways. So over to the first one. So Hemant, can you kindly, yeah. So the first one is shared by Paul Merrill. So we are talking about the test engineering. So what he says is that we believe that most important solution to overcome increasing QA and testing challenges will be the emerging introduction of machine-based intelligence. So essentially what we covered here in the session with Paul Merrill is how machine learning is going to be used in testing in going forward. So software testing is essentially, what happens is we have a lot of cloud-based. So please turn over to the next slide. So hundreds of simultaneous users using a cloud-based application where there are multiple containers serving their requests, and there are millions of log entries that are generated by monitoring tools such as New Relic or Datadog or Logstash. And then, how do we make sense out of supposing, let's say there is a race condition and we want to make, what was the set of events that preceded the race condition. We need to analyze the logs, and it's humanly impossible to go through these millions of records to find out what exactly went behind or went before the race condition really happened. So, that's where machine learning, unsupervised machine learning, that senses the exact patterns in the log entries to predict and reproduce the errors. So essentially the job that was done by testers of writing test cases would be taken up by machine learning, wherein log entries would be, patterns in log entries would be sensed, and that those patterns would be essentially the test cases, that if you reproduce those patterns, you would be reproducing the errors. So this is just one application of machine learning. There could be many more. So some of the repetitive tasks, so essentially testing is repetitive, and that those repetitive tasks can be learned by machines. So it is possible to simulate human actions like scrolling, swiping, zooming, etc. on mobile phones using machine learning. A new breed of testers who will understand this enough so that they can train the machine. So essentially these actions will have to be carried out by human testers first, and then the machines would be learning. So there would be a new breed of testers who would be training machines. So instead of record and playback, it would be replaced by train and test. So again, this new breed will have to face ambiguous expectations, less repeatable workflows, because machine learning will generate rules at runtime. So it is not, the test cases are not as well defined as they are when you're doing manual testing. Machine learning will also help us by pointing us to most susceptible parts that need our attention. So very often it happens that test automation always tests those rock solid parts of the application, and very rarely you detect any significant bugs using test automation. But with machine learning, it is possible for you to point the automation to those corner cases where you are most likely to discover bugs. And it will thus work from within the application and inform us what to test. So in a way, it is on the fly writing the test cases and scenarios. So this implies that most of the testers will have to acquire some kind of development skills. As you can very well see, that this requires some level of understanding of machine learning and statistics. So these are developer skills, and those will have to be acquired by testers. Alternatively, testing can be done by developers. So essentially what we are saying is, the test engineering or testing would be essentially taken up or subsumed by the developers. So with this, I'll let Hemant talk about his next takeaway.
So our next takeaway was this attention to agile mindset at executive leadership level. So there were 3 sessions, and I'll spend a few seconds on each of them, the main ones. The first one was by the keynote on Monday morning by David Marquet, where he talked about intent-based leadership. The second was a session by Steve Denning and his associates on business agility. And third was this topic of leadership circle. So let me cover each of these to highlight the takeaway on how much attention is being paid to agile mindset at the executive leadership level. So many of you may have read the book Intent-Based, the book by David Marquet, Turn the Ship Around, where he talks about greatness and intent-based leadership. So the essence of his keynote speech was essentially this notion. In his case, he tells the story of how he had mastered as a captain of a nuclear submarine, how he had mastered a particular submarine called Olympia, but he got assigned to a different submarine, Santa Fe, and then because he didn't know the details of how that Santa Fe submarine worked, he was faced with a challenge of how to give command and how to follow the usual command and control model without him knowing all the details. And that kind of brings in some of the realities that we find in agile development, where the team knows a lot of details. So he talked about the idea of letting the people in his organization, giving them the high-level intent, and let the people who know the specific submarine make the specific decisions. And essentially the idea of moving the authority where the information is rather than the other way around, and creating an environment for thinking and letting people take initiative. So that was the first session, which drove home the point of at the leadership level what one should do. Second was this session by Steve Denning. He's one of the stalwarts in Agile community, a management thinker, and he writes for Forbes and so on. So he talked about, he has an organization, Steve Denning Learning Consortium, which is a non-profit organization, and the members are organizations who are doing research and better ways to apply Agile ideas and across organizations. So they talked about, based on their research, this idea of business agility across the organization, and how the paradigm is moving away from a customer revolving around the firm or a company, the other way around, where the firm has to compete with other firms and revolve around the customer as one of the core ideas. And they summarize their findings of research in these 4 core business agility practices. First one was delighting customers. Second is descaling and simplifying work. Third is nurturing the culture. And fourth is applying agility enterprise-wide. So that was the second kind of leadership-related talk that drove the point home. The third one was this universal leadership framework called Leadership Circle. So this is a framework which has been applied, which has been used outside of Agile, but has been now being applied in the Agile context because it seems to fit very well. It is aligned with Agile values and principles. It has robust research behind it and statistical validation behind it, and it is very actionable. So this talked about a leadership circle as a framework where the vertical axis is a idea of creative tendencies or creative competencies of a leader versus reactive tendencies. So reactive tendencies being somewhat negative, creative competencies being positive, and their mode of whether they are good at task completion versus building relationships, and using this framework to build leadership skills. And they talked about how the empirical evidence, as you see in the next page, as it refreshes, really gives robust empirical data with the top 10% of performers. You see them, the leadership level scores very well on the creative competencies and vice versa. So this is a good framework to get to know. So that's the takeaway on attention to leadership at Agile level. With that, over to Vinayak. Let me skip the next one.
Thanks, Hemant. So, yeah, so this session was taken by, it was covered by Elizabeth Ayer from Redshift. So maybe last year or year before, we had talked about this company Redshift, which is known for having the entire team participating in user experience design. So if you remember, they had participated in an exhibition or a roadshow or some kind of trade conference wherein they had a booth in which they went with a product idea that maybe they could build something which kind of is somewhat similar to, let's say, GitHub or something that does version control for databases. And they went with this high-level idea and they presented a clickable prototype on day one, and they collected feedback and used that feedback overnight to incorporate some changes. And on day 3, they actually had a more evolved version with order forms out at the booth. And in fact, they collected 600 orders at the end of that particular exhibition or roadshow. So this is a very novel way of getting immediate and instant customer feedback to what you think are your ideas or your minimum viable product, by having the entire team, including the developers, participating in user experience design. So she says that there are, no one's a UX virgin, so everyone in the team actually participates in interaction with the users. So that way everyone is informed and everyone finds purpose in doing what they are doing. So what you see in the picture on the previous page was, in fact, developers calling the customers and doing user research. So, to start with, in fact, developers paired with the user experience designers so that they could understand how the research is done, and it's the dev team, not the product owner, who managed the backlog. So what is more important for the customer was understood by the entire team, and they were the ones who actually managed their prioritization, and the whole team was involved. So for example, when they did the user interviews, they were noting the responses, attending in listen mode, and everyone was a part of the user research and interviews. And it was all right for them to participate and even quote the names of individual users or individual customers and what their preferences were. So the use cases were directly related to the individuals. So when they discussed, developers discussed the use cases or user stories, they actually named the participants or the end customers with their names as to what they liked and what their preferences were. So that actually gives credibility. So as a result, the developer teams were able to aim better. They knew what they were doing and why they were doing what they were doing. So this brings back us back to the point that I was saying when we started, that developers are in fact getting into user experience. So first we talked about how they're getting into the testing area, and now in this we talked about how they got into the UX area. In the next takeaway, we'll be talking about how they get into the ops area. So with this, I'll let Hemant cover the next takeaway.
Yeah, so our next takeaway was this topic of adopting agile practices and agile values out beyond the typical engineering organization. So over the last decade and a half or so, software development and QA organizations have obviously adopted agile practices. So there were a number of sessions that covered this, but this was an important takeaway. So the early adopters appear to be, of course, marketing and operations as it goes with DevOps part, and then HR. And the lagging adopters appear to be more finance, accounting, and perhaps legal. Let me hit a few more highlights on these topics. So there was a session on marketing, following agile practices in marketing, and they had customized the agile manifesto to be applicable in the marketing context. So that's what this slide is showing right now. And then this was the session I'm referring to was presented by CA team. And if you remember, CA acquired Rally a few years ago. So it kind of makes sense in this session that the marketing team at CA, which is total size of 300 or so, a part of that, which is 50, started following agile practices in their team. And of those 50, 20 had come from Rally. So it made sense that the team that had come from Rally side had deeper familiarity with agile practices and agile values. So it made more natural sense for them. And they customized or applied the Agile principles in the context of marketing, changed some terminology. For example, product owner became marketing owner, which is natural. Instead of stories, they talked about jobs to be done, so it made sense, and so on. And instead of a shared organization, shared service became more of persistent feature teams with each with a very well-defined metrics and goals, and encouraging overall T-shaped skills. So instead of having specialized content writer or social media marketer and all that, you have people in the marketing organization who are T-shaped skills. So that was one application. Then it was also covered in other sessions. For example, in case of applying Agile values in HR. So for example, instead of individual performance reviews, start moving towards team performance reviews. So that's one example in HR. And then also in finance, following instead of annual budgeting, moving to things like beyond budgeting or innovation accounting and so on. So I think these are all ideas of Agile that have come from Agile practices being now adopted beyond Agile and more enterprise-wide, as you see in some of the other takeaways. So over to you, Vinayak, for next.
So here we're going to talk a little bit about continuous delivery. So continuous delivery is the main reason why DevOps is becoming really central to performing IT organizations. So as you can see in this infographic, the high-performing IT organizations, they actually have very frequent deployments. They're deploying 200 times as frequently as other firms. And as a net result, the lead times are close to 2,500 times shorter lead times. By lead time, what we mean is the time it takes from the time someone conceives or conceptualizes an idea to the time actually a customer sees it in production. So it doesn't take weeks and months as it used to take, but it takes just a few seconds or just a few minutes to deploy something that you would like to test as a hypothesis. So as a result, you spend less time on unplanned work and rework, and more time is now spent on new work. So your teams are focusing more on doing innovative work instead of doing the routine work of lifting, shifting, making, taking data, extracting data, loading data, copying files, starting servers, stopping servers. Now all that unproductive work is taken up by automation and continuous delivery. So that is something which was enlightening. But coming back to our story and moving to the next slide, how this is all replacing the ops with development skills. So what we saw that containerized microservices are really replacing the need to have some kind of scripts which are written in various languages on tools like Chef and Puppet. It's not really required because you don't need to script your configuration. The configuration can be stored in the form of a container. So such as Docker container has the configuration as well as code stored in the Docker image, and using a Docker file and Docker Compose, you will be able to fire both the code and the configuration that goes well with the code simultaneously. That also gives you high fidelity or high compliance between various environments. You don't need to really worry because whether your test environment is different from your dev environment and production environment is different from the other two, because you're deploying it in the same container which is going to behave as well in all three circumstances, in all three environments. So you don't need to really so one of the big things that operations were engaged in was creating and configuring these three different environments and deploying the same version of code in these three environments. That is no more required because you have a container which you can fire and you can you run it on any of the environments. Also, it leads to faster startup and faster shutdown, so there is no need. So the overall cycle time taken for operations is less. It gives better environment fidelity, and that again reduces the ops role. And the applications here are decoupled from the infrastructure, so you can very well see that it's the infrastructure part which was very high on the minds of operations people now no longer plays any part. As long as you're virtualizing and you're in AWS or some kind of cloud environment, you really don't worry about what the infrastructure is. And orchestration platforms such as Kubernetes are again making it much more easier for developers. For example, if you require X number of servers or X number of instances to take care of the load, you just have to declare it in Kubernetes, and supposing one of the instances goes down, Kubernetes automatically restarts it. Also, you have patterns such as the circuit breaker pattern. So if in case one of them is timing out, Kubernetes will kill it and then bring up another one. So almost all the load balancing work is automated and orchestrated by Kubernetes. So that again reduces the work that was being done by DevOps in before this is now being handled by development or developers. So this is something that again brings back to the first picture that I had shown, that the entire cross-functional team is now requiring development skills. So with this, I'll let Hemant talk about the next takeaway.
Yeah, so our next takeaway was this notion of acceptance test-driven development and its related practice of behavior-driven development. So the chart on the right, which shows this relative cost of fixing a defect on the vertical axis, and the horizontal axis is the stage of software development lifecycle. So if something is caught at the requirements level, leftmost part, and if that's 1x as a relative measure of cost of fixing that defect, then if you catch that defect in the production stage post-release, it is 150 times more expensive. So that was a kind of a core idea around which this topic of acceptance test-driven development made a lot of sense. The idea is to catch defects early on, and I know many of you have seen some version of these charts before, but this notion of having upfront, before you start writing code, you have your trio of your product owner, developer, and tester come together, collaborate in this notion of Amigo review and come up with acceptance test. And basically you follow the format of Gherkin language of given, when, and then, and then you can automate that with Cucumber and few other tools that can be put to use. But do that using that format and then automate the running of those tools, so your regression cycle goes down in this example that presenter gave from 3 hours or so down to 1.5 minutes. So that's the very powerful way to really catch the defects and avoid them early and improve your throughput. But the challenge is, how do you get going? So it makes a lot of sense, but the key idea here is to get started with this, and the core of it is to have the test first mindset. But the presenter asserted that once the teams that they have seen, once they start following this practice, they never go back. It starts spreading because it's such a good practice. And of course, you got to do the unit test-driven development practices before you can get to the acceptance test-driven development and behavior-driven development. And then, of course, automating these is a key idea. So I wanted to bring this next page, which talks about the value of automation testing. So this is from a keynote address that on Wednesday morning, Jez Humble presented. And I just took one data point to illustrate this. He talked about, among other things, his experience with the HP LaserJet case study. And on the left side, circa 2008, when they had no test automation, they were spending only 5% in that green sliver. Only 5% of time of the team was being applied towards building new features. Essentially, the rest of the 95% of the time was in some way essentially overhead. Integration testing, other forms of manual testing, rework, and all that stuff. So only 5% of the engineering capacity was being applied to innovation, which is new feature development. Once they adopted test automation, Of course, you are now investing 23% of the engineering capacity to run and maintain test automation framework, but it freed up 40% of the engineering capacity to do innovation, new feature development. And that's where the real payoff of test automation is, to free up significant new engineering capacity for new innovation. So with that, over to you, Vinayak, for next takeaway.
Yeah, and before I go over to my next takeaway, I just want to reconfirm the 40%. So that's a number that is pretty much in agreement with what I had covered in the infographic on DevOps first. So there again, automation was like close to 40%. So that's a good universal number, empirical number that one can remember. The investment in automation pays off to the extent of 40%. So with that, let's talk about dynamic reteaming. So this session was very interesting, and you need to reteam very often to scale. So you have pockets of excellence in your organization. How do you replicate excellence? How do you scale it? So pairing is a good way, but unless you have people moving across from those pockets outside or moving into those pockets, how do you pair? So dynamic reteaming is a way of doing that by scaling and growing, by splitting teams and growing, having cross-pollination across teams. And this is something where we need to actually move people. You can't have them split their time, like having multitasking, like you see in the picture on the right-hand side, is not a good idea. You actually need to move people from team A to team B. You can't just have someone who is very good splitting his or her time between multiple projects. So that's the idea behind the dynamic reteaming. And this was practiced in mob programming earlier in hunter industries, as we had seen in the last or year before last. Woody Zuil had covered this concept of dynamic reteaming, where you have people moving. So there are various forms of reteaming, as you can see. So, one person moving or multiple teams you take one person from multiple teams and form a new team. Or the mitosis pattern, where you break a team that grows beyond a 2-pizza team into smaller teams, so on and so forth. So these are various patterns of reteaming, and it helps in cross-pollinating and growing and scaling. So that was something that definitely was a good takeaway, and we have started practicing this within our company, and we are hopeful that we will see some good results. So let's go to the next one.
Okay. Next takeaway was on this topic of estimating time /effort/cost. And most of you in software development know this is a struggle with all software teams, how to do a better job of estimation that management calls for. So the two main kind of a thought leaders on this that I'm reporting back by way of takeaway is first one is the work by Troy Magenis. He had a session this year also. I think he's been presenting almost every year on related topics. So his point was of using statistical techniques and sampling techniques to do good, robust estimation rather than bottom-up estimation. And I'll cover a little bit more detail of that with examples. And all of Troy he's made his spreadsheets and his tools available. You can just go to this link that I have shared here. And his idea is, ultimate idea, of course, is don't even use story points. Just don't use all the range of story points, at least use smaller ones, and better yet, just break your stories down to smaller stories and just count them. That's good enough way to estimate. And then the second session, second thought leader on this topic is a little more extreme viewpoint which is identified with hashtag NoEstimate. And this is still a very, very passionate, debatable topic, and it was covered in an OpenJam session also. Let me cover a little bit more of NoEstimate for those who have not been aware of it. If you have not been aware of this topic, I highly recommend following up on some of the blogs that these three thought leaders have been writing on this topic. Woody Zuil, of course, I think is probably the main one who has started this hashtag NoEstimates, but then Vasco Duarte and Neil Killick. So the idea is that so the original idea from Woody was, to to push the thinking that teams waste time on doing estimate, and their ways to make the real decisions for which you thought you needed estimates by NoEstimates. And then Vasco Duarte has talked about, that estimates are a waste of time and they don't really directly add any value to the process. And of course, Neil blogs and talks about that there are better ways. It's about improving the way we work such that estimates become redundant. You don't even need them. So I suggest following up on some of these and reading these to question at least some of the time we all end up spending on bottom-up estimate. Let's come back to the statistical techniques that Troy talked about. So I took two examples that stood out to me in this session. One was example of if you were to estimate the number of defects, let's say you inherit a piece of code or a large body of code because you acquired a company or you acquired a team in whatever way. One simple technique is to do sampling. So take a piece of code and your objective is to estimate how many defects it has. You take two teams, team A and team B, and you give them a certain amount of time box, let's say an hour or whatever, or a day, and then they go looking for defects in that independently. And team A finds, let's say, 5 defects, team B finds 4 defects. All you do is you say number of defects found by team A multiplied by number of defects found by team B divided by the common defect the both team found. In this example, if team A found 5 defects, team B found 4 defects, but of those 2 defects were common across both teams, you just use the simple statistical technique of estimating total defects to be 5 multiplied by 4 divided by 2 equals 10. That's a good established way instead of going through spending a lot of time. So that's one example of using statistical technique. Second example is if you have to estimate a scope of work and you have some number of stories, just take a sample. If you take 7 to 10 samples, the key thing is to take random samples and take random samples, and 7 to 10, by the time you have 7 samples, you can probably have a close to 87.5% confidence that you have gotten the range right, and you can just use that sampling and multiply by the number of total stories, and that's good enough way to estimate. So these are simple ideas. So net essentially on estimation, do's and don'ts I wanted to summarize based on all these things that have been discussed. One is use where possible in your systems, issue tracking system and project management system. If you have real historical data, use that. That's very effective rather than doing a bottom-up estimate. Wherever possible, like I showed in these two examples, use statistical techniques of sampling as a way to come up with estimation. Use heuristics. If you've done similar projects before, use those. Those are very effective. And more importantly, pay the same level of attention to the value estimate, the revenue or profit estimate of a project versus the cost estimate. Most of teams tend to look for too much precision on the cost while completely ignoring the value side of the equation, and that doesn't make any sense. And finally, on doing the estimation exercise is often very valuable as a learning exercise for the team to have a discussion, conversation, and dialogue around the scope and the complexity of each story, and that's useful. We shouldn't ignore that part. What you shouldn't do in estimation exercise, avoid the urge to do detailed bottom-up task-based estimates. That's a waste of time. It takes too much time. You could be building something useful in that time. And finally, question that why you're negotiating estimate. Negotiate the decisions that are important, and that estimates have enough error around it. Negotiating estimates is not a good exercise. So that over to you, Vinayak.
Yeah. So as we will be talking about in the Soundbites, estimation or planning, when you actually start executing, it goes haywire. So finally, but then still it is indispensable. So doing the exercise of estimation and doing the exercise of planning is important. But you can't really take that as the final gospel, because when you actually start executing, you'll find that your plans and estimates they tend to go haywire. So talking about planning, how do you plan? So you plan by having prioritization of your user stories in certain order. So you say that you want to have the high value user stories at the top and the low value user stories are at the bottom. So you know, what Chris here in this session said was, look, how do you define what is high value and how do you define what is low value? So you define the outcome based on how the user story is changing the behavior of the user. So if you have a user story that doesn't change the behavior of the user, then why it is there? So that's his way of looking at it. So taking the product backlog and prioritizing it based on the value, which is again determined by how much it contributes to the outcome, which basically means whether you get the desired change of behavior from the user. That is something that will determine how you will prioritize your product backlog. Moving to the next slide, Chris again continued talking about a concept that he calls the hook. So this hook model actually is covered by Neil in his book called Hook. So let's take the example of Facebook. So you have 4 things that you need to look at. One is a trigger, which triggers you to take certain action, and then after having taken that action, you get some sort of a reward, and then you keep doing this trigger action reward for a certain number of cycles, and you end up investing in that application so much that you can't move away from the application. So for example, in Facebook, when you are bored, you pull up your cell phone and that's the trigger. So internally you feel this sense of boredom. That is why you want some entertainment, and you pull up your cell phone and you look at Facebook, and maybe you post something. You post a picture. That's the action you take, and the reward you get is the number of likes or the number of comments from your friends. So that's a variable reward. Again, there was a Skinner box experiment that he talked about, wherein if the reward is constant, then there's no suspense, or there is no doubt in your mind. If the reward is constant, then in that case you don't get the same level of excitement. Excitement comes because you're not sure of what the reward is going to be, and that's why it's important to have variable reward. For example, in Facebook, when you post a picture, you're not sure if all your friends are going to like it. It depends on how good your post is, and then that's why you're going to go back and check who all liked it, and or who all commented on it. So that's the variable reward, and then you go on doing these posts repetitively, and supposing tomorrow if there were a better application than Facebook, you still don't move away. You won't move away from Facebook because you have all your friends and all your pictures posted on Facebook. So that's your investment. So that kind of locks you into the Facebook application. So that is the hook model that he talked about. So to get your users hooked, you need to essentially affect the change in behavior. And this change in behavior is what is going to determine the value that the user story brings. So that's how you will prioritize, and that's how you will determine what gets delivered first. So with this, I'll let Hemant talk about, and there's one more, sorry, Hemant, there's one more concept that he talked about, that is herding, artificial scarcity, and anchoring. Again, these are all concepts of playing on consumer psychology. Like, for example, when herding is a concept where when in holiday season, all of us tend to do shopping because everyone is shopping. Artificial scarcity is you see on a rack that or on a e-commerce site that there are only 20 remaining stock, and the maximum order is 12. So the general tendency there is to order 12 pieces, even though you can do with 6, but then there are only 20 in stock, might as well order 12 because that's the maximum that can be ordered. So that's the consumer psychology part that he talked about. So again, how we can change behavior by designing the application in a way that will affect the consumer psychology. So with that, I'll let Hemant talk about his next takeaway.
Our next takeaway was in this topic of using some framework for applying Agile across several 100-person engineering organization. So as many of you know, there have been at least half a dozen or so frameworks of some sort, including disciplined Agile delivery model by Scott Ambler or large-scale Scrum and so on, have been around and discussed in this conference over the previous years. What was important takeaway for us this year was the SAFe framework by Dean Leffingwell, Scaled Agile Framework, seems to be gaining ground and becoming the dominant, at least by way of adoption. You see this data on the Scaling Agile from the State of Agile report, and this confirms that what we observed anecdotally walking the floor and attending the sessions and so on. So Scaled Agile Framework, which went through a few weeks ago, 4.5 release, appears to be the most dominant one. It seems to have the momentum and a supporting cast of ecosystem of consultants who are trained on it, and they can work with organizations in training them and adopting the SAFe framework and all that. So that seems to be part of the reason. Other part of the reason appears to be is the nature of the framework, as I'll show you in a minute, the picture. It seems to be a little more comfortable for larger companies and executive leadership team to be able to adopt. It seems to have the overall framework that allows portfolio level management and lean budgeting and all those ideas. So net, the Scale Agile framework with 4.5 release seems to be gaining ground and becoming the dominant form of scaling framework in the organization. And when we look at the 4.5 version right now, it seems it has completely embraced the lean startup paradigm of MVP, minimum viable product, and lean UX, and of course DevOps and all those. So it seems to completely allow companies who would otherwise have resisted this, thinking that SAFe is very burdensome and all that, but it seems to have all the bells and whistles that you really can't argue against now. So here's the picture, and you guys can go. We've given references to all this material. None of this is our own intellectual property. We are reporting on the Agile conference what we shared, so you're welcome to follow up. And this particular one, SAFe 4.5 version, it has levels now in the new version, which of course they always had the team level, and then above that the program level, and what used to be the value stream level and now called large solution level, and then of course at the portfolio level. And as you see on the left side, it has the lean UX and all the ideas related to lean startup adoption. So this kind of a framework seems to be more conducive to large companies, and that's why it seems to sell better in that environment. Over to you, Vinayak.
Yeah, so an Agile conference, you always talk about frameworks, and Spotify was one of the frameworks that was very popular. So we talked about last year, if you remember, we had talked about gears and tribes and squads and all that. So and consultants are kind of swearing by the Spotify model. They're saying that, look, this is how they do it at Spotify, so that's the right way to do it. And there were some sessions like that in the conference, but at the same time, two people from Spotify, they said, oh, wait a minute, I mean, who says that this happens at Spotify? Because we are insiders in Spotify and nothing like that happens there. So that was kind of a total surprise, and I attended this session. So they say that, Spotify is a model. After all, a model is something that is a model. It doesn't really represent reality. So even though we have the model in the Spotify blog, it doesn't mean that we exactly follow what is there. And, for example, they talk about pairing. Now, pairing is not done exactly in the way it is prescribed. I mean, they showed that pairing is differently done in different teams. Same thing with test-driven development. Some of the squads do it, others don't. So it's not like, you follow, and when they did a survey and they had simple things like clean code or solid principles, some of the developers in Spotify hadn't even heard of these terms. So it's not, Spotify themselves are evolving. I mean, they're trying to follow the pivotal pairing model, and some of the squads are pushing back because pairing is extremely stressful. I mean, you can't pair for longer than a couple of hours. So one of the reasons why Spotify is unable to really keep up to their own model is because of their growth. So they're really growing really very fast, and it is they're hiring bright engineers, and so that is kind of affecting the move fast and break things instead of moving slow to move fast. So they're really growing fast, and let things break and then let's fix them as we are growing. So that was pretty much the surprise that we saw at Spotify. So that despite the notion that we had that there is a role model that we can just follow. After all, Agile is not about going through the motions, but it is about the mindset. With this, so this is a picture of the pairing, how it is different. I mean, there's no copybook way of pairing. You can do it the way you like. Yeah, over to you, Hemant.
Next takeaway, a final one actually, before we get to Soundbites. And what we'll do, Vinayak, is I'll cover this takeaway, and then we'll do a quick reminder of Synerzip value prop, and then we'll go to Soundbites in the interest of time. Okay, so this was a takeaway, essentially an update on the role of architect in Agile teams and how architecture is handled. And most of you are hopefully familiar with the basic thought process, but the main kind of a update-wise is that there is no official architect role in Agile teams. Architecture is a shared responsibility, and one idea is the team should together tackle some of these architectural topics. For example, define landing zones for key system characteristics. If you want to, for example, if throughput is a system characteristic, you just decide that for that throughput system parameter, you want a minimum of 150,000 throughput ability, and target is 270, and outstanding if you overachieve is 320 is a good number, and just use that as a landing zone for that parameter and design an architect for that, and then tweak these along the way as the customer adoption happens, and do it as a team. And all architecture work is rolled into user stories and keep it visible. I'll show you a slide on that also. And same thing, actively managing technical debt, and make sure you think of technical debt. A good idea was to think of it into at least two categories. One is, floss category, which is routine stuff like hygiene, do it regularly, don't lose sight of it. Another is a more root canal kind of a refactoring, which is painful, long drawn, and you undertake that only when you really need it, and you are in pain in terms of system scalability and so on. And the related idea of color your backlog, which is keep everything visible. So this is actually a slide that the session was by Rebecca Warrock. She shared from Philip Crutchen, Professor Philip Crutchen's session in one of the previous years. So maintain whether it's a visible part of the backlog, which are features and defects, or it is the invisible part of the backlog, which is usually architectural stories or technical debt, and just keep the color them, so that way product owner and stakeholders can view them clearly, and you can account for them in every sprint. So with that, let's kind of turn our attention to, I'm going to pace through quick slides, and just for those who are new to us, talk quickly about Synerzip in 30 seconds, so that at least we tell you about who we are, and then come back to Soundbites. And when I'll quickly cover my Soundbites and then turn it over to you to keep it simple. So Synerzip is essentially a outsourced product development partner for our clients, and we help our clients accelerate their technology roadmap by working with us and providing them agile teams to deliver. And our teams tend to have large range of technology skills. So whether it's cloud enablement or DevOps or UX and all that, so we are able to bring those. And we have a team that Vinayak represents sitting in India. So with that, we are able to provide 50% cost advantage. And we also have a team in the US between Silicon Valley and Texas. So we are able to augment and cover easily with the US-based clients. And this is just a picture of some of our clients. So you will see. So with that, let's turn our attention to the Soundbites. I'll cover quickly a few of my Soundbites which didn't get covered. So let me just pick this. Let me skip this one. So number 4 worth mentioning is often teams, during development teams, tend to own the output, working software, and someone else owns the outcome, which is customer impact. I think it is better to have the both same team, whether they own both outcome and output, and that is a better way to create impact. My number 5th was pair programming and peer code reviews are very effective ways to do quality control or risk management rather than any other form of external reviews. These are easy techniques one should use. And then my final one worth highlighting was this idea that if you're putting together a team and a dev test system, try to do it in a way that the right thing to do is also an easier thing to do. So just for example, putting in automation framework so that it is easy for the team to go through full regression test cycle by push button. So in the interest of time, let me turn it over to Vinayak to hit your highlights of Soundbites before we wrap up. We got 3 minutes.
Yeah, so I will just quickly talk about one or two of the Soundbites. So every business is a software business, so this is a big realization that is coming. And most of the companies, whether it's a car company or a pizza company, is turning to software as its strategic, central. It's not something like a staff organization, but it is strategic and central to most of the organizations. So that was one of the sound bites I wanted to cover. The other one is talking about metrics. So if you want to compare metrics across teams, that's not a good idea. So if you're taking, for example, velocity, it's not good for you to compare across different teams. But you should use these metrics to compare with the same team, compare metrics to compare with yourself, your own performance in the past. And if you have to compare across teams, use ratios. So that is one takeaway. And the other one is if you want to have one universal metric, that is the time it takes for you to get the information. So if you request for a metric and it is taking a lot of time for the team to come back with those numbers, that itself is a good metric. So the longer it takes, the story, it has some story why it is taking that long. So that itself can be used as a metric. The longer you delay the release, the more is the pressure to accommodate changes and additions. So this is another takeaway. So delaying the release is actually, you're saying that, okay, if it is going to take 2 weeks for me to bring in my next change, I might as well push it in this release. But instead of that, if my next release is going to happen in 2 days, I'm ready to wait. So I think I covered the last one already, so I'll allow some time. I think we are almost there, but allow some time for questions.
Yeah, so I think we ran out of time, so let me just actually bring this one up, which is our next webinar coming up next month in September. We're almost there already, and this topic of lean UX plus DevOps. So stay tuned for that. And like we said, we had to rush through these 12 takeaways and our sound bites. So to all of you who are attending today, you're welcome to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to pick any of these topics or related topics and have a conversation with you guys. So thanks for joining us, and we're done for today's webinar.
Thank you.